Thank you so much, Monica. Our next speaker is Dr. Andrew Marsh, Professor of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst.
All right, thank you, Dahlia. Thank you, everyone. Nice to see everyone again after a few years. The title of this panel is Political Islam, a 45-Year Retrospective. And historically speaking, one of the most remarkable events in the past 45 years of the history of political Islam is this turn to quote-unquote Muslim democracy. As Monica said, this is something that was talked about in the early years of the AKP in Turkey in the early 2000s, when AKP was a democratizing force as opposed to a ruling power. But of course, we see that this is one of the most significant events during the 10-year Tunisian democratic interlude, when in 2016 Ennahda declared itself formally to have quote-unquote left political Islam and entered into something called Muslim democracy. As I mentioned a second ago, many intellectuals within the sphere of the AKP in the early 2000s referred to themselves in this way. We are not Islamists, we are Muslim Democrats. Other scholars and commentators have applied this moniker or this label to other parties and movements in places like Pakistan, Indonesia, Bangladesh, possibly Morocco, and Jordan. And so there's a question here, a very simple question. If Muslim democracy is a term, what is it a turn from and what is it a turn to? Now there's two very, very obvious ways of asking this question or forms of analysis. The first is to ask, what is this in terms of a political structural analysis? What does it mean for parties and movements and actors to identify themselves in this way or to act in a particular kind of way? What is Muslim democracy as an empirical, on-the-ground kind of description of political behavior? And the other is to ask what it means from an ideological, doctrinal, or meaning-based standpoint. So very quickly, in terms of a kind of political structural analysis, I think we're going to want to distinguish between movements, actors, groups, thinkers that are either calling themselves Muslim Democrats or others are calling them Muslim Democrats in semi-authoritarian, semi-democratic regimes like Morocco, Jordan, and again, perhaps Turkey in the early 2000s, when you see a transition away from military rule, a judiciary that is hostile to democracy, so on and so forth. Distinguish that from action within fully democratic regimes. And here Tunisia, possibly Pakistan, but Tunisia may be the only case in which you have a political movement referring to itself as Muslim Democrats that is able to operate in a democratic context. So what should we think about this sort of turn from within that standpoint? One way of looking at this, most obviously, is that it's simply a kind of rebranding. It's simply a way of saying, think about us in a particular way as opposed to another kind of way for the purposes of electoral competition, for the purposes of, as Monica said, the relationship with influential actors outside of the country or outside of the region. But it can also be understood in sort of political science terms as a kind of signaling or a commitment to device to other parties. So it is part of a way of signaling your commitment to the kind of political system that you're constructing democratically, and that you're not holding behind some kind of aspiration to hegemony or to controlling the entire political system. It signals a kind of move from a counter-regime politics, potentially revolutionary, even if it's peaceful, even if it's purely political, to an internal regime politics. It's sort of saying political Islam, with apologies to Jocelyn, political Islam as a kind of set of parties or political movements that sees itself as fundamentally opposed to the existing regime, even if it's not violent, even if it's not trying to overturn it through armed force, to a kind of a political movement that sees itself as internal to a regime or a constitutional order. All of that is fairly clear. I think all of that is very much consistent with what Monica was saying, which is that don't really see Ennahda as an Islamist party in any significant way. It doesn't explain their coalition practices. It doesn't explain necessarily their policies, the kinds of things they do when they're in power. It doesn't even necessarily explain the way they campaign for power during elections. All right, so that is all fairly sort of straightforward, but what does it mean if you're interested in political Islam, again, over this 45 or perhaps 70, 90-year period as political Islam or Islamism as a distinct kind of political ideology, political ontology, political vision about the world? And so again, I want to pose the question, what is Muslim democracy a turn from? And here, just very schematically, I do want to identify the idea that traditionally Islamism is an ideological movement that is characterized by the possession of a grand idea. It is impossible to understand the political movements of Islamist parties, the intellectuals, the doctrinal formation, the socialization, the kinds of things that were being written and being read, without acknowledging that there is this grand aspiration to an alternative, an ideological, intellectual, moral, spiritual, epistemological alternative to secularism, nationalism, and to authoritarianism. So it first has to be acknowledged that Islamism makes no sense unless you acknowledge historically the ideological aspiration and ambition that it represented. But secondly, and I want to be a little bit more precise here, what I believe that Islamism was characterized by, both in its anti-democratic and in its pro-democratic forms, is something that I call the sovereigntist imaginary. So we all know that traditionally thinkers like Maududi or Sayyid Qutb identify the core idea of Islam as a commitment to divine sovereignty. But as we see a turn towards democratic Islamism, particularly in the writings of Sheikh Rashid, you see also this emphasis on the concept of sovereignty. God is sovereign, but so is the people. The people is also sovereign. Now, the important thing here is that this is not only an anti-democratic move. It's not only to say the military is not sovereign, the king is not sovereign, Bin Ali is not sovereign, the people is sovereign. But it's also a move that emphasizes, when you read it carefully and when you take it seriously, that a particular kind of people is sovereign. Why can both God and the people be sovereign? Because the people has certain kinds of qualities. The people is a believing people. It is a virtuous people. It is a moral people. It is a people that is morally united around a commitment to Islam. That's what I mean by the sovereigntist imaginary. You can imagine politics being organized around a concept like Siyadat al-Ummah, because the Ummah is perceived as having a certain kind of moral unity. So now, what is Muslim democracy a turn to? So if it's a turn away from those things, it's a little bit less clear what it's a turn to. It's not about Islamist rule over the state. It's not about imposing Sharia. It's not about single-party rule or domination. But what I think when you read carefully certain kinds of statements, particularly by somebody like Sheikh Rashid, about what is the meaning of our understanding of the 2014 Constitution. Why do we accept what is more or less a secular democratic order? You have a number of certain kinds of very relatively deep considerations about the question of freedom. So, I should also mention, I should also sort of pitch here that there's a volume coming out later at the end of the summer by Sheikh Rashid and myself called On Muslim Democracy, which is a collection of 10 of his, I think, most important essays, and then a series of dialogues between him and myself attempting to identify what is this turn to Muslim democracy. So a lot of what I'm saying here is drawing from that. And so what I argue is that an important thing is a historical reckoning with the concept of freedom. And not just the positive concept of freedom that you see in traditional Islamism. Freedom is Islam. Freedom is the Sharia. Freedom is being governed by God's law. It is that, but there's also a historical reckoning with ordinary negative freedom. Freedom from coercion, freedom of choice, freedom to affirm this or affirm that, and the conception of political freedoms, to organize politically, to be independent from the state, to have organizations of civil society. Second, there is an acceptance of actually existing political pluralism, not an ideal political pluralism. That is, well, of course we have the people of the book. Of course we have people that we recognize as non-Muslims. There's a recognition of actually existing pluralism. There are Bourguibists. There are communists. There are the trade unionists. There are the people that hate us. They are part of the political community, not some ideal conception of what Islam or the Ummah recognizes as reasonable pluralism. Third, there's an understanding that politics is a kind of negotiated contract around shared worldly goods. It is not about the application of an ethical order that precedes politics and is derived from revelation. And then finally, the grand kind of legitimating discourse around this is a move from kind of theological concepts like the sovereignty of God or the people, the Ummah as God's Khalifa on earth. And there's this increasing emphasis to the foundational, exemplary force of the Prophet's covenant of Medina, the Sahifat al-Medina. This is the single most consistent claim, that the Prophet formed a political community in Medina that was pluralistic. It was not based on everybody being Muslim. It was a political contract that granted citizenship without regard to theological or creedal agreement. And if that was good enough for the Prophet, it's good enough for us. All right, so just to conclude for real, what is this all a turn to? So what is, in a grand kind of 45-year retrospective, how should we understand the ideological significance of the idea of Muslim democracy? And I want to give two simple ideas. One, it is post-sovereigntist. It is not obsessed with the conception of sovereignty, neither God's nor the people's. And that is a major turn, because throughout the 20th century, the central concept was sovereignty. God's and the people's, the ummahs, and how to reconcile them. The turn to Muslim democracy does not begin with this question, who's sovereign? Where is sovereignty located, and what follows from that? But, unlike a lot of the popular discourse, it's not just about these cliches like moderation, or not being anti-democratic or authoritarian or something like that. There still is a distinct vision of politics. It begins with the fact of politics as a core fact of political life, in which politics is characterized by conflict, disagreement, but also the most important goods of the world: stability, security, maslahah, economic stability, freedom, all kinds of things. And so the idea is that the world does not begin with revelation, and then we apply that to politics. We are always found in this kind of political moment, but it does not mean that there is a commitment to giving up ideological or religious goals. And so my argument is that Muslim democracy represents post-sovereigntist, agonistic political Islam. It leaves aside this ideological obsession with sovereignty. It accepts democracy on realistic grounds, on realpolitik grounds, but it sees politics as nonetheless a space not where you necessarily give up all of your ideological objectives because you have to be moderate or you have to be secular, but sees politics as the place to pursue them rather than some kind of pre-political ideological commitment. So now we're in this place where we have this idea, but where does it exist in practice? Okay, perhaps still in Turkey, perhaps that's a way of understanding Erdogan for all of his authoritarian tendencies. But with the destruction of democracy in Tunisia, I think we are forced to ask this question: is there a future for this aspiration of Muslim democracy, or again, like Monica was saying, is the death of democracy in Egypt, Tunisia, Syria, other places a sign to, as Monica called them, right Islamists, to completely go back to the drawing board and say, well, what is it exactly that we see as the foundational, orienting, ideological commitment of politics? Thank you.